On this episode of Newt's World, I'm joined by members of my Inner Circle Club for a fascinating conversation about a wide range of issues and topics on their minds. We hold these regular video conference calls so that we can have an honest discussion about what is happening in America today. I find it extraordinarily helpful to me personally in helping think through the issues that are facing us. So I hope you'll find this episode of Newt's World informative. And if you'd like to become a member of my Inner Circle Club, please go to newtsinnercircle.com and sign up for a 1 or 2 year membership today. There are actually a ton of things to talk about. Let me start with, in some ways, the most interesting. Nate Silver, who used to be the New York Times pollster, who founded 538, which is a very, very respected polling firm. And they now have Biden at a 37.5% approval. And Silver came out and said, maybe they need to replace Biden. He said, I don't know how much worse it has to get, but if he keeps dropping, there will be a point where the Democrats, it's suicidal to keep Biden on the ticket. Now, that's really tricky because, as Mark Halperin has pointed out in his Wide World of News, Biden has the delegates. Biden was in the primaries. He is the president. But I found it interesting. Silver's not a shallow or trivial person. And he's really giving the Democrats a huge warning that at the rate things are decaying, that Biden may literally be unelectable. And that has all sorts of consequences for not just the presidency, but the House and the Senate. So that's a big story. The second big story, which I'm writing about in a series of newsletters at Gingrich 360, is the extraordinary vote in Europe. There were some 27 countries that voted for the European Parliament. To show you how complicated it is, they vote in about 24 languages. So it's really an amazing process of democracy on a continental-wide scale. In almost every country, the populist conservatives had a huge gain. The Greens lost ground, and the traditional left lost ground. The pro-Brussels, pro-European Union people lost ground. It was a European earthquake. Giorgia Meloni, the Prime Minister of Italy, was a big winner. She'd campaigned very hard for the conservative populist candidates around Europe, and they gained a lot of ground. Marine Le Pen, whose father had founded the Conservative Party in France, and she now has succeeded him as the leader, they wiped out President Macron's party so badly that Macron literally that night called for a special election, dissolved the parliament, and in June, France is going to vote, and it could lead to the first National Action Party prime minister in history and a tremendous shift of power towards Marine Le Pen and setting her up to run for president. The Germans saw the Greens virtually collapse. They saw the old Socialist Party, which had produced the chancellor. They disintegrated and dropped dramatically, actually got at 13%, the lowest vote they had gotten since World War II in modern times. So it was a shattering defeat for the left in Germany. And of course, France and Germany and Italy are the three biggest countries in the European Union. So when all three of them are moving to a populist conservatism, something very big is going on. As an example of how over time the failure to solve problems has weakened the left, Geert Wilders, who is the longest serving Dutch parliamentarian, originally was seen as a radical, was ostracized, people wouldn't touch him, he was a terrible person. Well, his party just won 37 seats because from the time he first went into the parliament in 1992, the problems of drugs, the problems of crime, and the problems of illegal immigration all got worse. And the Dutch resent Brussels, having bureaucrats who try to regulate everything. And so he's now become a major leader in Dutch politics when 30 years ago, people would have said that was impossible. And you see this pattern all across Europe where people are fed up with big government. They're fed up with Brussels as a bureaucracy trying to dictate to the whole continent. They are fed up with illegal immigration. They are frightened by radical Islamization, and they want real change. And that's occurring literally in virtually every country. The handful of places where the change was not occurring had already changed earlier. So like in Hungary, for example, you have already got a very strong populist conservative government. They did okay, although they had a new rival, which was also populist conservative, but was running against what was seen as corruption in the existing government, but it wasn't ideological. It was over the performance. Now, at the same time that all this is happening on the continent, we have the British Conservative Party disintegrating. I think that they have in Prime Minister Sunak a person who is very unsympathetic, lacks the ability to understand the dance of politics. And you have a party which has been in power for 14 years, which is a very long time. They've run out of ideas. They have been dominated by the left. My hunch is they're going to have the worst Conservative Party vote since 1905, and the party will just be shattered. There's a possibility that they'll come in third or fourth, and at that point, it really will be interesting to see how Britain evolves from there. In Ukraine is doing better than the newspapers had reported. The great Russian offensive sort of petered out and didn't get very far and cost the Russians a lot more bodies. And the Ukrainians are gradually getting better. They had apparently in the last few days flown drones hundreds of miles inside Russia and taken out one of Russia's most expensive and most sophisticated stealth aircraft. So there's a lot more going on in Ukraine than we're sometimes led to believe. In Gaza, there's a very interesting phenomenon which gets almost no play in the American media. The leading Hamas fighter in Gaza has a deliberate strategy of getting Palestinians killed. And he has no interest in giving up. He has no interest in a truce which would require them to give up fighting in the future. And he has indicated very clearly that he's just going to be there. Sinwar is his name. He's going to be there as long as it takes. And that his goal is that not a single Jew will remain. Well, the Israelis have been day by day working their way into Gaza. They recovered 4 people in an amazing raid. And it turns out 3 of them were being held by the Al Jazeera reporter in his apartment. So this guy who's supposedly a reporter is so clearly a Hamas sympathizer that he was holding hostages. These are the kind of things that make it much more complicated than the Biden team thinks. Anyway, it's pretty clear that the Israelis are going to keep going until they finish up destroying Hamas. That may take another couple months because they're going carefully. They're actually trying to minimize civilian casualties while fighting in a big city with well over 1 million people. I think it's very possible that when they finish the Gaza campaign, that within 30 days they will pivot and take out Hezbollah in Lebanon. Hezbollah has been firing rockets endlessly into Israel, has forced the Israelis to move about 100,000 people out of northern Israel. And historically, the Israeli position has always been to never fight on Israeli soil, that if you have to fight, go into the other guy's place and go after him. Now, obviously, the Israelis don't want to do that while they are in the middle of a war in Gaza. They could technically fight a 2-front war, but they really don't want to. It would really deeply strain their economy. And I suspect the odds are at least even money that once they finish with Hamas, they'll pivot and they'll do everything they can to destroy Hezbollah, because Hezbollah has over 100,000 missiles. They have been deliberately trying to pick a fight on the northern front. They've been doing a dance of not hitting Israel hard enough to force Israel into a big attack, but hitting Israel hard enough to keep the Israelis off balance and to remind them that they have a danger in the north, not just the south. So we'll see how this all evolves. A lot of things going on around the world. It is a dangerous place. I guess lastly, I'll just say that it is more than astonishing that Donald Trump's conviction in a totally phony case, I said it was a fake conviction, which I believe it is, because you had a fake judge, a fake district attorney, you had fake information, and totally misleading. There was no law broken, and it's just crazy. But the result was an enormous surge for Trump. He actually gained ground in Scott Rasmussen's poll and was pulled ahead a little further. He raised a huge amount of money in the opening round. And I think a lot of people who didn't particularly want Trump, but are so fed up with Biden abusing the law and misusing the law and see it as a threat to them, that if he can do it to Trump, he can do it to them. And so I think there's been a surprisingly big resilience in favor of Trump. And I think that he actually has come out of this much stronger than anyone could have predicted 6 weeks ago.
Our first question, Newt, is a write-in from Lindsay in Virginia. Lindsay asks, do you have any predictions on who Trump's running mate will be? In your opinion, who do you think would make a good running mate?
I wouldn't imagine trying to outguess Donald Trump. He's thinking about it. He's talking about it. He's asking for advice from everybody. We know that he likes Tim Scott. We know that he likes Governor Burgum of North Dakota. We know that he likes J.D. Vance, the senator from Ohio. We know that he likes Marco Rubio a great deal. He has openly said that he believes that Ben Carson should be on that list. He has put Elise Stefanik seriously on that list. In one way you can tell if you're serious about it is if you have to go through a vetting process where they come and sit down with you and they go through your life and all your records and all your problems. And we did this, Calista and I had to go through it in 2016 when I was sort of the semi-finalist with Mike Pence. And we had to go through a vetting experience. And it was interesting. So I suspect all these folks are doing that. I wouldn't want to predict who Trump will pick. I do think he's very concerned that it has to be somebody who could be president from day one. He's aware of the realities that something could happen. I think he wants it to be somebody who deeply shares his values, which is why I think he could never look, for example, at Nikki Haley, who in a more calculating political world, she might make sense to balance off the ticket. But if you're thinking in the long run about governing, she just disagrees with him too much. So I think he's going to want somebody who is compatible with kind of a MAGA approach and a Trump philosophy. And I think third, he's going to want somebody who potentially can win in 28, because I think Trump now understands, in a way he didn't in 16, that it is going to take 2 or 3 or 4 presidential terms to undo the bureaucracies which have been built since 1932. Remember, the left has had literally 92 years to build their machine. And so you can't just go in and rip it out in 1 or 2 or 3 years. And I think Trump understands that. And his hope would be to have a vice presidential candidate who could grow into a very powerful presidential candidate in 2028.
The next question comes from Mary, who's writing from Idaho. Mary asks, has it been difficult restoring faith in the voting process for unsure Republican voters? How can voters be sure that the election process is legitimate in 2024?
I do think that it demoralizes people to think that their ballot may not be counted, or it may be counted wrong, or it may be drowned in a bunch of phony ballots. I would say 2 things. One, vote as early as possible. Whenever your state begins voting, if we could win the first day and have more Republican than Democratic votes, that would be such a shock to the system, which has historically relied on Republicans to vote at the end and allowed the Democrats to build up a big margin. Second, I would say, if you're willing to, Mary, volunteer to be a poll watcher. It's going to take 10 or 20,000 poll watchers. And I know that the Republican National Committee has a very large, very expensive project to go into places like Philadelphia, Detroit, Atlanta, and have lawyers and poll watchers all over the place. That's what it's going to take. Democrats stealing votes is nothing new. way back in 1973, I was quoted in the Atlanta Constitution as saying that you had to win, Republicans had to win by at least 4% to offset the vote stealing by Democrats. And I think that that's historically almost always been true. It goes back to Tammany Hall and a long tradition among Democratic machines of stealing votes. And so I think you just have to assume we got to get all of our votes out. And in particular, because Trump does better with what are called low propensity votes, people who are historically not as likely to vote. And then second, we have to have so many volunteers who are out there as poll watchers that the left simply can't get away with stealing. It's a great question. I appreciate, Mary, you asking it.
The next question comes from Joe in Florida. Joe writes in, what are Trump's next steps in overturning his false conviction in New York, and how will this impact the election?
Well, I think he clearly is going to appeal to the New York Court of Appeals. I think there are some circumstances, and Mark Levin has talked about this, where he can appeal directly to the U.S. Supreme Court. And I would not be at all surprised to see that happen. That procedure was used in Gore versus Bush in 2000, and the U.S. Supreme Court stepped in and took over the case and stopped all the vote counting and really locked down Florida at a point where the Democrats were trying to complete the job of winning it for Al Gore. So I think there are situations where he might be able to appeal it. The other side of it is they have sort of put the judge in a hard spot because the lawyers for Trump agreed to sentencing 3 days before the Republican convention. Now, I think it's possible, because Merchan is so deeply anti-Trump, that he might put him in jail just before the convention. But I think that when you're dealing with the nominee of a major party going to his convention, I just think that's probably not going to happen. And so he's either going to get a suspended sentence or he'll get a sentence which will begin next year or something. It's just crazy.
Thank you, Newt. The next question comes from Dr. Cheryl Novas.
Thank you so very much, and thank you for this session. It's always so important. I've had the opportunity over the past few months to present to the International Public Safety Association as far as prepping, getting ready for what is coming up. And what I'm hearing, and I'm basically asking this question for many, with Antifa, which is what is ramping up, do you see any correlation with the Muslim Brotherhood during the Obama elections era that dissolved Acorn groups and the dissolved Acorn groups as they'll raise their heads during this election to intimidate conservative voters?
I have not personally run across any of that, and I think that it's not very likely where their focus is going to be. I mean, if you'll notice, the biggest demonstrations right now are anti-Semitic and anti-Israel. And the energy that's out there right now to demonstrate, ironically, is actually demonstrating against Biden. The Democrats may well have a bigger demonstration problem in Chicago than Republicans will have in Milwaukee. So I think it's going to be interesting to watch. Conservative voters are very hard to intimidate. Think about all the red states. There's a sheriff in Florida who said he'd be quite happy to lock up any demonstrator who wants to come down, and he'd be glad to meet with him. And, they could spend a few weeks in jail thinking about it. Apparently had no demonstrators come to his county. The tougher it is on crime, and the tougher it would be on an Antifa-like demonstration.
The next question is another write-in from Blake in Georgia. What are your thoughts on Biden's mishandling of the economy? Do you think that this issue will lose him the election?
I think the economy is the biggest single problem he's got in getting reelected. It's the thing people talk about the most often. I talk about Bidenflation rather than inflation. And I've said over and over again that you can't run enough ads to offset going to the grocery store. And I think it's the grocery store which is killing Biden. The person who's been really articulate about this is Meghan McCain, who has 2 children now, and she has a number of friends in her age group. She said, couldn't afford to buy Jif peanut butter, had to go to generic brand from the store because literally the difference in price was that great. And they're in that tight a budget. Well, when you have that attitude and you think that the budget, that the economy is ultimately Biden's problem because he's president, it's very hard for Biden to get reelected. And I think in that sense, what the White House doesn't understand is it's not communications, it's policy. And it's not promises or attacks, it's performance. And people have decided that his policies don't work, that the performances aren't acceptable. I almost think it's a matter of survival. You said to people, do you think you could survive 4 more years of Biden's inflation? Do you think you could survive 4 more years of open borders? I think you'd have a surprising percentage say no, they can't.
The next question comes from Jeff Epperson.
Newt, how do you see the relationship between the establishment wing and the populist wing in Congress today?
There's clearly great tension. There is a very, very conservative element in Congress. The Freedom Caucus sort of typifies it. There are about 10 or 12 U.S. senators that fit into that. And then there is a bloc that's conservative, but not as militant. And most of the other senators and most of the other House members fit into that. In the Senate, McConnell, by enormous skill and energy and drive, had dominated dramatically. He wrote a good book, by the way, called The Long Game, which I recommend anybody who wants to understand the Senate and wants to understand politics. You'll find Mitch McConnell's The Long Game. It helps you understand what he did. I think the fact of McConnell leaving or stepping down, he'll go to the Appropriations Committee, but the fact of him stepping down as leader will automatically lead to a more open leadership in the Senate than they would have had. I think that as Mike Johnson gets better and better at being Speaker, that's working pretty well, and he will gradually gain control. I mean, his problem is when you're down to a 2-vote margin, somebody somewhere will be mad about something, and that's all it takes for you to not have the votes to get past anything. So Johnson has the hardest speakership job since the beginning of the Civil War, much harder than what I did or what anybody else, Nancy Pelosi or anybody else. And I think he's growing into it and he's getting better. And then you have Trump. I mean, the truth is this is now Donald Trump's party. He's the dominant figure. His endorsements are enormously powerful in the primaries. I think he's meeting Thursday with the senators, Senate Republicans, to talk about next year's agenda. And I think that's remarkably good and so different from 2016 when no one thought he could win. And now I think people begin to realize, that there's a very high likelihood he's going to be president again and that they better figure out how to talk with him and work with him.
The next question comes from Thomas Quinn.
Thank you very much, Newt. My question is pretty straightforward and simple. One look at Joe Biden, and I have to ask, who is really running the White House?
I'm guessing that there's 5 or 6 people around the chief of staff and that they actually are trying to hold it all together, the National Security Advisor, the Secretary of State. As a historian and as a citizen, it scares me to have Joe Biden as commander-in-chief. This is not a partisan comment as a Republican or as a conservative. But when you live in a increasingly dangerous world with very real threat of nuclear weapons, and you have a commander-in-chief who clearly is declining in cognition. The scene yesterday, which may have been totally innocent, but apparently he just froze up for like a full minute standing there. We don't know where his mind went, but it wasn't at the meeting. He was outside as part of this party they were throwing for Juneteenth. And he just, for about a full minute, just didn't move. And his eyes looked totally vacant. I personally find that pretty scary. Scary not politically, but scary for the national security of the country.
Our final question comes from Charles Kilmer.
The conviction of Trump on bogus charges in New York will increase his mandate to change federal policies toward colleges because of the federal interest in educating students to be good citizens in a self-governing democracy and not mere subjects to a ruling elite, which communist ideology mandates. In a speech this year, you mentioned that a pollster found that while 6% of American population thought it was okay to steal elections, Over 60% of the people from elite universities thought it was okay to steal in elections. This is the result of 3 generations of communist training at American universities, training that the federal government itself has largely paid for, enabled, and certified. From the looks of policies I've seen that the Trump team has talked about, his team is pretty upfront about extirpating the whole woke agenda from K through 12 in education. Trump's education team sounds a little more oblique about what they will do in universities. It generally looks like they want to get rid of DEI and 1619 Project from American colleges. But this was before Trump's conviction. Now the stakes are much higher. Would you agree that to maintain a functioning republic, the basic policy toward universities should be to fund and decertify the communists from the university faculty and staff and replace them with course studies that emphasize Bible study and civics? I would suggest Bible study because the Bible is what Jordan Peterson calls the precursor to understanding the truth. And civics is required to teach students how to be self-governing students and their role in the republic. Both together, because the extirpation of communists from academia would leave a religious and political hole. If it's not quickly filled, the communists will return more powerful than ever. This is what it currently looks like. The Trump team's current proposals for academic portend. If you agree that the Trump team should be far more radical than they're currently contemplating.
Some of it's happening at the state levels. Florida's been very aggressive about this and has begun to really move to defund the whole DEI routine and to change the rules of the game. I think that it's very important that we insist on enforcing the federal law, which requires universities to tell us if they get foreign money. I mean, the amount of money that Qatar has apparently put into American universities is breathtaking. And we need to know, what are the Chinese communists doing? What are the Saudis doing? And I think that has to be public and accountable. I also think that we probably should rethink a great deal about how we approach higher education in general. It's one thing to be having world-class science and technology, which we need to sustain the momentum of our economy and of our national security. It's another thing to have a permanent anti-American establishment dominating the universities. And I think that's got to be taken on. We have to replace a substantial number of people or just basically defund the universities. You can't have people who destroy our civilization paid for by the taxpayers and honored as though the things that these kids are learning are reasonable. They're learning things that are lies, and they believe the lies, and they're going to operate based on the lies. So I think your point was very, very important. I find this very useful. I hope you all found it very helpful today. It gives me a chance to learn from you, and it gives me a chance, frankly, to organize my thoughts, to share with you what I think is going on. And if you find it useful, I hope you'll tell your friends and encourage them to join the inner circle and to be part of this kind of a regular relationship. And we're starting an experiment, which I'd love to hear back from you about, which is to send you, when I run across something I think is really interesting, I'm just going to send it to you. I'm not going to make some big, long newsletter. I'll just say, I found this interesting. You'll probably get a fair number of specific, interesting items over the course of a month. Thank you for listening, and thank you to members of my Inner Circle Club. And if you'd like to become a member, please go to newtsinnercircle.com and sign up for a 1 or 2 year membership today. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan, and our researcher is Rachel Peterson. The artwork for the show was created by Steve Penley. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcast and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Right now, listeners of Newt's World can sign up for my 3 free weekly columns at gingrich360.com/newsletter. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.